Hello, welcome to Image Bearers. My name is Otoma Edje. I'm very excited to have on the program today Ben Weatherston, who is the evangelist leading the church in Grand Rapids. Welcome, Ben.
Hey, good to be here, man.
Good to see you too, buddy. So this is, again, Image Bearers. This is season 3, episode 23.
Wow.
And Ben did a lesson, I guess maybe a couple months ago for the Detroit church staff. And the title of the lesson was Of First Concern. And it was basically a lesson to help encourage us the best way to think about various aspects of our lives. So he's going to kind of break that down with a presentation for us. The 4 R's, if you will, that he's going to cover are our rights. You know, is that the most important thing for us? Or our royalty, which is basically lordship, our relationships with each other, and then rules. So it kind of breaks them down as to what order we should put those in to really just be pleasing to God. So again, thanks so much, Ben. I'm going to sneak away and give you the floor so you can share your presentation.
Yeah, man. No, I totally appreciate this, bro. And I'm really excited to even just get a chance to talk to you. I know we've talked several times from Detroit to Grand Rapids over the last year. And I'm just really excited to be able to present this stuff. I think and I think a lot of people maybe that have watched your podcasts or your YouTube videos know about the book Misreading Scripture Through Western Eyes. Mm-hmm. Great book. I highly recommend it to everyone. Well, 2 of these R's, so I call this my 4 R's, 2 of these came from that book. And it really, when I first started thinking about it after reading that book, man, it just opened up my eyes to a lot of clarity in my thinking. And so what I'm going to do today is kind of show how that evolved over the last 3 or 4 years. And so I added 2 more R's to that equation, and it has really helped me. And I've used this to explain things to other people as well. So if you don't mind, I can just jump right into. I have a little presentation. So the title is Of First Concern. That's not necessarily the scripture we're going to be looking at, but it does reference the fact that Paul was clear in his communication about certain theological priorities. And there were things he was like, Jesus dying and raising from the dead, that's the most important thing. And so it's good for us to be able to know where things fit in our discipleship and our theology. And what we're going to get at later is not just where they fit, but when 2 things start to bump into one another, like which one gets prioritized and which one gets sacrificed. And so we're just going to go right through these. Now, I will say that it's oh gosh, sorry. Oh no. My bad. I will say that everybody got to see my iPad there. That it's very, very, very important. It's very important. Like, I can't stress how important this is. It is very important that these things are filtered through the lens, I guess, of your personal discipleship. So if you are a disciple of Jesus, the things I'm going to be talking about have to do with your personal discipleship. I am going to say these things from my standpoint. Like, this is about me. And then if you like what you hear, then you can apply it to yourself. Now, when I talk to other disciples, I will tell them like, hey, this is important. But then this really, what I'm going to present to you has almost absolutely nothing to do with non-Christians. People who do not make Jesus Lord of their life, this is what we're going to talk about is going to seem a little foolish. So number 1 warning, do not dare go to your non-Christian friends and try to make them live this way. It is not only ineffective, it's harmful. And hopefully that will make sense as we get through it. I'm going to circle back to that at the end just to make sure we all understand that. But so I use these 4 R's to help people understand the way I look at the world and my life. I do not use these 4 R's to do a lot of instruction about how other people should live. Okay, and we're going to jump right into that. So I have these 4 icons that I use for this, and the first one is the throne, and the throne represents royalty. Now, what do I mean by royalty? Well, when I'm talking about royalty, I'm talking about our lordship, which is, Jesus is Lord means something. It's our master-servant relationship to God and to Jesus. This gets into the very sticky topic of obedience. And, my Lord says I have to do something. This is what I have to do. This also gets into the higher covenantal relationship between us and God. The verse I used right there, Matthew 25:23, everybody knows this. Well done, my good and faithful servant. Come and share in your master's happiness. This should be our number one priority. This should be of first concern, is the royalty. This is the umbrella that the kingdom represents, God's authority and rule and reign in our life. And so when I am filtering my decision-making in my life through my discipleship, royalty is at the top. So if that means that other things need to be sacrificed for my lordship, that's what takes precedence. Okay. I hope that's not too controversial to most Christians, but you never know. So royalty is the number one thing. And that is just me as a slave of Christ to my master. Because like I said, when I said Jesus is Lord, that needs to actually mean something. And so let's move on. Because first I'm going to define them, and then we're going to talk about how messy it gets when they start banging into each other. So the next one is relationships. And I'll put myself here. So in relationships, what do we mean by relationships? Well, the icon I use is the hug. And the hug is the familial relationship, the family, the one another relationships, the brother-sister relationships. And so this is where we're talking about our love for each other and people. It doesn't have to be with Christians. This is relationships in general. This could be relationships with your family, relationships with your coworkers, relationships with random people on the street. This is where we as human beings and image bearers of God, we have an interdependence to one another. None of us are islands. And we also respect each other's consciences. So we don't do things that purposefully hurt each other. I hope that makes sense. Again, we could pick 100 verses about this. The one I just happened to put down there is Romans 14, which is I think some of the most important chapters in the Bible are Romans 12 through 15. But he just says, let us make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification. And when you go back and read Romans 14, boy, you get a picture of how important relationships are, and that we can't just be right and they're wrong. Like, we all have to work together. We have to make it work, because that's part of the Christian experiment in the first century. Like, is this going to work? Especially once the Gentiles came in, relationships were the next biggest thing under royalty. And so the next one, these are the 2 R's that I got from Misreading Scripture Through Western Eyes. It was relationships and rules. Now, the icon I use for rules is the handshake. And so this is where you and I, we agree on how things are going to operate. These are our rules. And you'll start, and some people may have a negative reaction to rules, but I hope they can move past that, because rules are everywhere. And when I say rules, that's a very broad term that just means the way we run things. Even just society and civilization is based on certain rules, and that's okay. So what I'm talking about here is, even in the church context, like, we have a family culture. It's separate from our national culture or our generational culture or socioeconomic culture, but like in our church, we'll have a family culture, and that would go under the heading of rules. Like, hey, this is how we do things. Social contracts, like, hey, this is how, men and women should interact with one another. This is how adults and children should interact with one another. I would put binding and loosing under this, and like, okay, we're all going to decide that this is what we mean, and this is how we interpret the scriptures. This is what we're going to do as Christians. And then just the general heading of this is how stuff gets done in this group. And this will change from group to group. So your church will have different rules in your workplace, will have different rules in your family, will have different rules in your extended family, and they all might have different rules from society at large. But this is just how we do things. And I'm going to give you some examples of that a little bit. The scripture I used, I think is a humorous one, but in 1 Corinthians 7:12, this is talking, Paul's talking about husbands and wives and divorce and stuff, but I love the fact that Paul clearly says, okay, I'm going to give you a rule. This isn't God. This is just me. And that's okay. We're okay with that. Like, we can read the Bible. Now, it would be great if Paul was that clear on everything he said, but he wasn't. So we have to do some interpretation. But the idea that he said, hey, I'm giving you what I think, and this is how we're going to do it, but this isn't from God. And I hope that we can be that mature, that we do have rules that aren't necessarily in line and lockstep with what we consider our royalty. And then the last thing is the raised fist. And this is the rights. And this is where it gets a little stickier, guys. When I say rights, what I'm talking about is kind of broader culture, like our American culture, like we have rights as citizens. This also comes into play when we start talking about entitlement, like even very basically, like, hey, if you've ever heard someone say like, well, you can't talk to me that way. That's kind of what they're getting at. And then all the stuff that goes without saying. Like, we just have a way of a basic foundational way that things are done here. Now, there's a lot of verses, again, that we could use to talk about this. 1 Corinthians 6:7 is the one that I just happened to come to mind when I think about this. It's the fact that Paul says to the Corinthian church, like, you can do this. This is very important. He was talking about lawsuits. You can do that, but you shouldn't. And that illustrates what we're going to be getting at, is that you have a right that you can purposefully set aside, which is, if you think about it, and again, this shouldn't be controversial, but that's the whole Christian faith, is that rights that we don't exercise. And so another great example is when Paul could have very easily avoided a beating by raising the fact of his citizenship. And yet he went ahead with it. And that's shocking, and something that I think a lot of us probably would not do. And so those are the 4 R's, okay? Royalty, relationships, rules, and rights. And I will often, here's those 4 icons: the throne, the hug, the handshake, and the fist. And as you go through life, you will find that you'll see this all over. Almost everything you do is going to fit into one of these categories. And in these, the way we interact, or our motivation, or the way we think about a certain thing. Where does it fit? And what's interesting is, for me, and this is what I try to communicate, for me, this is how I think of my discipleship. The most important thing for me is royalty. And by that, I mean my lordship to Jesus, and my role as a slave, as a doulos. And so below that, I prioritize my relationships, that other people in my life are the most important thing. Aside from my relationship with God, preserving a loving, interdependent, healthy relationship is the most important thing to me. Below that would be the way we decide things are going to work, the rules. Classic example of this. What time are we going to start church? That's a rule. It's not in the Bible. It has nothing to do with our lordship. But we have decided that, Detroit's going to start church at 10 a.m. And in Grand Rapids right now, we're having a 2 p.m. service on Sundays. And that's just how we're going to do things. But as you'll see, that gets a little sticky. And then finally is my rights. Now, I appreciate being an American citizen. I like having rights, and yet it is my duty as a disciple of Jesus to set my rights aside to preserve the culture that we've established, even if they conflict with my rights, to preserve the relationships of others, to preserve my lordship. And so I'm gonna spend some time explaining what happens when these 4 R's start smashing into each other, and something has to be picked, something has to be prioritized, and that means something has to be sacrificed. And so I call these intersections of these 4 R's, these points of sacrifice. Something's got to go, guys. You're not going to always be able to preserve. And so for instance, what happens when royalty is put over relationships? I think a lot of us have maybe even seen that over the conversion process. We studied the Bible with a guy who had a very kind of messy upbringing, and he had to sacrifice a lot to become a disciple of Jesus. And this is what we talked about, that royalty is the most important thing. And it's not worth it if you prioritize your relationships over your royalty. But then that means that we're going to have the smash up between relationships and rules. And this is, if you've read Misreading Scripture Through Western Eyes, this is a whole chapter in that book, Rules versus Relationships. And so when we preserve the relationship, this is healthy. When we preserve the relationship over the rules, then that means that things like tardiness, there's not a verse in the Bible that says expel the tardy brother. And so if someone decides, hey, I'm late, we could put the rule first and say you're doing things wrong and try to make it into something like a sin, but that would sacrifice the relationship. There's better ways to have that conversation. I'm not going to do that right here, but I have a very well thought out thinking about tardiness in the church. But if we go around sacrificing our relationships to preserve our rules, that's actually not good, and it could be very damaging. So we want to preserve the relationships over the rules. That doesn't mean the rules are bad, but then I will be willing to preserve the rules over my rights, and this is tricky. A lot of people get bristly when I say this. I'm going to give you an example though of where we would preserve the rules over the rights. And the example I would use is your right of free speech. And I like to use this with men, especially strong conservative American men who believe strongly in our First Amendment rights, that we should be able to say what we want, even if it's very offensive. And the way I would put this is, let's say you're sitting in a restaurant and some gentlemen come in, and you're at dinner with your wife and your children, and maybe you have a daughter. And the 2 gentlemen sitting at the table next to you start speaking in a very lewd manner. A lot of inappropriate language. And maybe some of that language is directed towards your wife. Now, what are you going to do? You may, if you're a self-controlled disciple of Jesus, maybe you would ask those gentlemen to stop speaking that way. Like, hey guys, could you maybe not talk like that in front of my wife and kids? That's a perfectly reasonable request, right? Now, are you saying that you think that they should not have the right to say whatever they want? That's not what you're saying. You're saying, I believe you have the right to say this. I'm asking you not to say this because in our society, we've determined that we don't talk that way in front of children. And we don't talk that way in front of, a family setting. Now, they could ignore you and they could put their rights first. I can say whatever I want. They could even ramp it up. But what you're doing is you're appealing to the rules of the society and you're asking them to set their rights aside. In the same way, I was in the teen ministry. We led the teen ministry for 6 years. And when I had teens over to my house, I was a grown man. I could enjoy an adult beverage. I like beer. And I could, but I chose to set my rights aside to preserve the rules that we had set up. Is that a teen event is not an appropriate venue for someone to be drinking alcohol. And so this is what I'm saying, is that there are situations where something is going to have to be preserved and something is going to have to be sacrificed. And this is just a great way to think about it. And there's way more nuanced examples of this. It's going to take a lot of thought. I see this in my life every day now, and I use this in my discussions with people. I would really encourage anyone who's listening to think about how this fits in with them, and then talk about it and say, oh, is this what I was thinking? And it's not, they don't just work in a linear style. Sometimes rights are going to smash into royalty and smash into relationships. And that's totally normal. I just put these in this descending order. Okay. And so I do want to say something though. I love America very much, but I would honestly have to say that right now in America, we are structured the complete opposite of what I would consider kingdom priorities. We put our rights of first concern. Then comes the rules over relationships, which is a very Western way of thinking. And then the idea of royalty, like what's that? Like this whole country's built on rejecting royalty. So why would we even think that way? And so this gets into a deeper, even deeper discussion that for the most part, our modern American way of thinking might be the exact opposite of kingdom thinking. And it's not always going to be like that. But I want to talk a little bit about what it looks like when these go through points of sacrifice. So what happens when you decide that my rights are more important than the rules that we have set up? Usually what you'll do is things like your speech is not wholesome. You will violate scriptures about how we are supposed to talk to one another. You'll probably fall victim to what I call the other legalism. And what is the other legalism? So legalism is saved by works and you obey the law and that's how you get to heaven. There's the other legalism, which is, oh, you think I should do this? You show me in the Bible where it says I have to do this. And if you can't find a verse that says that, then I'm going to do it. And we throw all the benefits of wisdom out the window. We throw all nuance out the window. We want a rule. And if there's not a rule, then I'm going to exercise my rights. Not good. We do this on social media. You say things on social media that you would not say to someone in the fellowship at church. Be honest. Most people. This is why if you want, I have a thing on social media. You can go to the church website and see. But we need to realize that when we prioritize our rights over the rules or the relationships or the royalty, it doesn't go well. Then the next one is, what does it look like? Rules over relationships. This is in the book. Please read Misreading Scripture Through Western Eyes. I'm turning this into an ad for that. But this is a perfect example of tardiness. If we were to rebuke the person that shows up late and not think of a better way to have that conversation, that person is going to get very hurt. The other time I've seen this, and I hope that it's not triggering to anyone watching from Detroit, but boy, I have seen rules over relationships when it comes to the church softball league. And that's the example I always use, because we have a very diverse church in Detroit and it's great. But imagine if you have a black brother who's very gregarious and full of life, and he loves to like trash talk, and he's there to have fun, and he's there to just enjoy the fellowship. but then you have, let's say, a more like, straight-laced white brother who's a little quieter, maybe an engineer, and he's there to play softball because he knows how to play softball. And what you have is this, it's a culture clash, yes, but it's rules versus relationships. And so someone will say, like, how dare you? I just can't see how disciples could do that in a softball game. And you could probably think of 100 other ways that you've seen rules prioritized over relationships. And so I would, again, go back and think about how we can prioritize the relationships over the rules. And then lastly, the relationships over royalty. That's a classic example when I've seen this in trying to help someone to become a disciple, and they just can't. They can't fight their aunt or whatever. They can't fight their dad, and it just becomes I'm not going to make Jesus Lord of my life because I need to preserve the peace in my home or whatever. I've seen this with brothers and sisters who know the questions they need to ask, and they can't ask them. They know the conversations they need to have, and they can't do it because they just want to keep the peace of the relationship versus actually like calling that person to lordship. And then lastly, I think this is why Paul says to rebuke an elder publicly, to make sure that there's not that favoritism, that just because he's your friend doesn't mean that he gets a pass on his sin. And I hope that makes sense. And so this is the way that I prioritize these. And I just want to say, and this is very important, okay? I just want to say, let me go back to what I said at the very beginning. This is how I see the world. This is how I navigate the world. And you may even disagree with me. But I want you to know, though, that I put our relationship over a lot of other things. And that's very important. That's extremely valuable to me is our relationship. Now, as soon as I say that rights aren't important, that is really going to hit some people it's going to hit different. People are going to be like, what do you mean? Are you saying my rights aren't important? And this needs to be clarified. And every disciple listening needs to be able to understand this, internalize this, and articulate this. That's not what I'm saying at all. In fact, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, if I have a non-Christian friend, their rights, including civil rights, human rights, their rights are part of my relationship with them, and they're part of my lordship, honestly. And so in these 4 R's, someone else's rights are usually in the relationship or royalty tier in my heart. It's my rights that are at the lowest. I sacrifice my rights. Now, if that person doesn't believe in Jesus, then it's my job to protect their rights. As soon as they make Jesus Lord of their life, I do need to help them be able to process this. I do need to help them understand, like, yeah, your rights are important. I'm not asking to take away your rights, but I hope you can see that there are things more important than rights too. And if every disciple of Jesus, every professing Christian in the country and in the world put their rights below the rules, the relationships, and the royalty, I think this world would look drastically different. Drastically different. And so here are my 4 R's. The royalty trumps relationship, takes precedence over rules, prioritizes over my rights. And these are my 4 icons: the throne, the hug, the handshake, and the fist. And so I hope this is helpful. I love being able to present it and to just talk about it. I've thought about this for the last 4 or so years, just really kind of formulated it. It's way more nuanced than this. There's a lot more Bible verses that go along with all of these. But I think it's very important that we learn how to do this prioritization. What is of first concern? And when we have to sacrifice one to preserve the other, what's it going to be? And so there you go, bro. I hope that was helpful. I don't know if you have any questions or if you want to have any dialogue here. I'd love to talk about it.
Yeah, so I appreciate it. Thank you so much for that. I've always appreciated your lessons from, your time here in Detroit. I felt they were very creative. You displayed a lot of wisdom and nuance, in your teaching, and just very faithful at the same time. Yeah, so I think for me, I think you and I have both read Escaping the Beast, and what comes to mind is, and I agree, not everyone may, accept your thesis. I definitely do, though. But between kingdom and empire thinking, you know what I mean? That's kind of what comes to mind, because it's almost like the world has discipled us into a way of thinking, which is, especially in America, individual, number one. And there's good sides. There's a good thing to that. We need to appreciate that. But we should be very careful about that too, entering the church, and understand some of the detrimental aspects of that at the same time. So that's number one, and that's where the rights come in. And I think the other one is, we get discipled into, kingdom thinking versus empire. Kingdom thinking is the 4 R's that you noted in order, starting with royalty, and empire thinking flips that. And as you had in your slides, also flipped it, which would be rights. And I think that it's a very important lesson for certain cultures in the United States that are more individualistic versus collectivist. And I think there's definitely a danger, to that. So I definitely appreciate, what you're sharing. Yeah. I did want to ask you on a separate note, though, and this is a little bit, in a sense, off topic, but I know this is something that I'm sure you think about, regularly. How are you working with the church in Grand Rapids right now to address some of the challenges, specifically with a bunch of the shootings and so forth? Or what's your thought process in terms of addressing those, to really just comfort and be there for the church with everything going on?
Yeah, I feel like here in Grand Rapids, I find myself, that's kind of our role, is helping people see the world in this kingdom way. And so, like, I'm working on a lesson about the Bible, police, and race, and it's just trying to help people see that the things that we see in the news, they are not separate from the Bible and from our kingdom thinking. Like, there is, for instance, in the summer we did a series called Spirit Taught Words. And what we did was we looked at things in culture that the word isn't in the Bible, but it's a kingdom principle, and it's very biblically based. We just have to know where it is and what it's called in the Bible. So for instance, we did one on racism, and we talked about the sins of racism. The word isn't in the Bible, but favoritism and pride and theft and hate and all these things, those are in the Bible. We did one on nationalism, and nationalism isn't in the Bible, but there's clearly, it's spoken of all the time. And so it's not like I'm trying to just hold up the newspaper and say, like, this is what we need to be thinking about. It's like, this isn't just in the newspaper. This is in the Bible too. We got to be able to find everything we see in modern day, our current cultural situation. We need to be able to be informed by Scripture, by discipleship, by the idea of basically, like, we're all image bearers. And so things like compassion, I could go on, but, like, I hope that helps. Like, my job as a minister is to give people a very theological and biblical framework to interpret the things that they see around them all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's a task. I think you know, I've been a little leery of this thought process where there's the Bible and tradition. I've always not liked that. But the reality is we should think about the Bible with the church traditional thinking combined in terms of how do we understand certain passages. And I think right now the church thinking, in my opinion, is becoming more Matthew 25 in some sense, in terms of this is how we really think about certain passages, not just Matthew 28. So I don't want to make this another podcast, but I think that what you're sharing is definitely true, and I think you're definitely living it. You and all of us are living it out in real time right now, as far as how to address these things.
Let me give you an example. So, and this goes back to the 4 R's and specifically the rights. So here in Michigan and in Grand Rapids, a lot of ministers have struggled with how do we have church services and what do we do? And I know in Detroit, because you were renting from a school, that was kind of the decision was made for you. You can't rent where you were renting. Mm-hmm. But everybody else, it's been very hard. It's been very hard. And because in our congregations, we'll have a wide spectrum of thinking on this topic of how we do this. And so a lot of people would come and say hey, this is what we can do. Churches are exempt from the COVID precautions. Mm-hmm. And that's because of our Constitution. Thank you, Constitution. I'm glad that we have the right to do whatever we want. But what I would then inform my church is that that's not what we're actually going to do. And so helping people through that thought process is really tricky. And it's fraught with misunderstanding and pain and hurt. And it's been very difficult. And so being in a position of leadership, I just heard Marty Solomon recently talking about this. Man, this is why I think, the scripture about we who teach will be judged more strictly needs to be taken very seriously. Mm-hmm. So I have to stand before God and say, this is how I interpreted the scripture and this is how I led people. And it's very easy to throw out opinions and not be held accountable for those opinions. And if the church is left in disarray, and there's a lot of people that can be like, oh, well, that wasn't my fault. And so, but for me, where I'm at now with leading the church here is okay, I understand the way you see the world. I understand you see the world. I understand the way I see the world. And I have a firm conviction of what I think Jesus wants us to be in the world, but I can't just cut people away. And so it's been very challenging all 2020. And even now it's been extremely challenging, bro. But this is why I communicate the 4 R's to people. That to me, I have to have a way to think through this where I say, yes, we can do this, but we're not going to. Yes, this is how we do it, but these people are more important. Yes, these people are important, but not more important than God. And that's just why I structure my thinking that way. So I think
with that's a matter of wisdom as to why you wouldn't just say, hey, we're not meeting, even though the church could meet, just as an example, we're not going to meet. And the reason is because you've used wisdom to say, well, it's not the best thing. But even with that, you're not just saying, guys, I'm the boss, so to speak. These are the rules. Even with that, you're employing, lordship, relationship, all these things to, even just communicate that. So I think this is a good guide in terms of how we should, kind of think through things. So I definitely appreciate that.
Oh, I appreciate that, man. Thank you.
All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Those of you that enjoy the episode, please click like and consider subscribing to the channel. And I will include in the show notes some information to the Grand Rapids Church if you want to listen to more of Ben Weatherston's lessons. Thanks so much for your time.